So why does NASA refuse to visit Mars? Cost, safety, sustainability are just some of the reasons why. So let's explore what's holding us back today. For starters, we don't know if our bodies are going to survive. The time it takes for humans to reach Mars is 9 months. And as of today, no one's been able to recreate Earth's gravity in space. The common image of astronauts flying in the International Space Station might be cool to imagine, but in reality, a microgravity environment can be detrimental to our bodies. The weightlessness makes everything effortless to do. Imagine lifting like a super heavy box as easily as holding a feather. So cool, right? Well, not using any force has massive consequences. Your muscles can atrophy, your heart weakens, your bone structure crumbles. In a nutshell, you're gonna not do so hot. For the moment, we've managed to study the effect of microgravity on the body of astronauts of the International Space Station and managed to slow them down, but they're only in space for 6 months at a time. The 9 months we need to go to Mars, plus the time spent there with only a third of Earth's gravity, might be too long to slow down the effects, and some can become irreversible and lead to premature death. One of the main issues discussed at NASA is the possible psychological issue of such a mission, by the way. Living in closed spaces, traveling in deep space, not being able to see or communicate easily with Earth for such an amount of time, not gonna do so hot on the mental health. As of today, nobody has left our planet as far as to not see it anymore, so it's hard to imagine how this would play on our astronauts' capabilities of handling pressure and risk. We don't want to sentence anyone to a death sentence. Not good. So what happens if something goes sideways and more help is needed? So here's the thing. The biggest challenge to go to the red planet is the time duration to go there and come back. The window for launch to Mars from Earth only happens like every 2 years and every 2 months, which means astronauts leaving in 2024 won't be able to, let me do the math, get help before 2026 when the next launch window opens, and help gets there after the 9 months journey. This time window makes it even harder by creating a mission of a very long duration, which can cause tremendous physiological and psychological issues on our astronauts. An interplanetary mission of that scale would likely be one of the most expensive and difficult engineering challenges of the 21st century. NASA's director of the ISS, Sam, said, "Mars is pretty far away. It's 6 orders of magnitude farther than the space station. We would need to develop new ways to live away from Earth, and that's never been done before. Ever. Mars's atmosphere is only 1% as dense as Earth, and contrary to our dear home, our neighbor doesn't have a radiation belt to protect us from solar and cosmic rays. The consequence of this lack of protection is a longer exposure to these rays, which are deadly to the human body. Astronauts living on Mars would be subject to 50 times more radiation than humans living on Earth. That amount of radiation can create very dangerous cancers. Because Mars' atmosphere is so thin, it doesn't allow the correct pressure for our lungs to breathe in the oxygen that we need. Also, it almost doesn't contain any oxygen, not nearly enough for us to breathe normally, which forces humans to recreate a living environment indoors and only go outside with pressurized suits. Not the easiest and not a great way to live. It's not sustainable, like we still haven't figured out how to grow food in space. Astronauts in the ISS aren't able to grow a sufficient amount of food to sustain themselves with, even if experiments are taking place. Everything they eat comes from Earth in a dehydrated or otherwise form. If a mission to Mars takes place, astronauts won't be able to carry with them the amount of food needed for such a long mission. So they'd need to learn to grow their own food. If this is already hard in the spaceship in a microgravity environment, it's even harder on the surface of Mars. It still needs decontamination to be used to grow plants, and we're not even 100% positive that's going to work. Also, there's still something we haven't talked about, and that's how we're going to create energy on the surface of Mars, because it's a lot harder than Earth. Mars is further away from the sun, so solar power is only 40% as effective as on Earth, and can even be lower in cases of dust storms. Wind power isn't useful because there's no atmosphere, and geothermal energy isn't going to work. Mars is a lot colder than Earth. In order to stay alive in space, people need lots of other things. We're talking like other than food. Oxygen, mentioned that before. Shelter. Fuel! Somewhere around 80% of the initial mass launched to space for a human Mars mission is going to be propellant. But storing that amount of fuel is hard. Objects in low Earth orbit, so that's where you'd park your Mars spaceship while you build it, travel around the world every 90 minutes. During half that time, they experience the intense heat of the sun and then the unheated blackness of space. That difference causes liquid hydrogen and oxygen, rocket fuel, to vaporize. So unless tanks are regularly vented, containers holding these materials are liable to explode. Hydrogen in particular is susceptible to leaking out of its tanks, resulting in a loss of about 4% per month. This means if a Mars mission required a year to assemble in low Earth orbit, it would lose more than half its propellant before even departing to the red planet. And finally for today, it's just too expensive. So let's set the scene. In the Martian lowlands, one rocky crater is dotted with small holes, winding from the floor to the rim like breadcrumbs. Their clean and cylindrical appearance is distinctly unnatural, suggesting the work of aliens. For quite some time, a robot from Earth has been collecting samples of rock and soil into 6-inch long tubes, whirring and crackling on the otherwise quiet planet. This robot, a rover named Perseverance, has deposited some of the samples on the Martian surface in those tubes. The others are just stored in the rover's belly. Perseverance is going to stay on Mars forever, but the majority of its carefully packaged samples are meant to return to Earth at some point. The Mars Sample Return Mission, known as MSR for short, is one of the boldest undertakings in NASA history. The endeavor, which involves sending the spacecraft to the Red Planet to retrieve the samples, serves as a precursor to getting future astronauts home from Mars. It's a test of whether the United States can keep up with China's space program, which is scheduled to return its own Mars samples in the 2030s. It could, yes, uncover new information about our planetary neighbor's history and reveal a picture of the cosmic wilderness that was the early solar system. Some scientists even hope that the dusty fragments are going to contain tiny fossilized microbes, proving life existed. And those tiny life forms will have been dead for who knows how long, but it would still be evidence of a second genesis. But that's all if those samples ever make it back here. NASA officials announced that the sample return effort has become too expensive and has fallen way behind schedule. The latest estimated cost of as much as $11 billion is nearly double what experts initially predicted. And the way things are going, the samples aren't going to arrive home until 2040, 7 years later than expected. At a press conference last month, NASA Chief Bill Nelson repeatedly called the state of the MSR program unacceptable, which is kind of wild because MSR is an in-house effort. Officials have put out a call to NASA's own ranks and to private space companies for quicker and cheaper plans that don't require huge technological leaps to bring samples home. The promise of such samples has been a top research priority for planetary scientists for over a decade. The original plan to do so, devised by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, is ambitious, involving several different spacecrafts to retrieve the capsules, launch them into orbit, flying back to Earth. No astronauts are involved, but scientists have likened the mission choreography to the Apollo program in terms of complexity. That plan was apparently destined to unravel from the start. NASA's independent review found that MSR had an unrealistic budget and schedule expectations from the beginning. It was organized under a really bad structure, with unclear rules, accountability, and authority. Technically ambitious missions always cost more. And MSR is arguably one of the most complicated that NASA has ever undertaken, and it's kind of the reason why we aren't sending humans anytime soon. For starters, imagine how much it would cost to send humans up there. I don't see Congress ponying up that money for NASA anytime soon. For scientists who support the Mars exploration, MSR is a problem, because it siphons away funds from other efforts. There's so many aspects to studying a planet that just don't involve this. There's one scientist, Catherine Niche. She's working on an international mission to map the ice deposit in Mars. Well, NASA pulled its financial support from that project in 2022 because of MSR. NASA is very aware of the all-consuming nature of MSR. As the mission is redrawn, officials have said they are even willing to consider proposals that would bring home just 10 sample tubes, 1/3 of the amount initially planned. NASA is going to seek input from the science community about which ones are more important. NASA has a responsibility to use funds in the most effective and efficient way possible, but yeah, that's why we're not bringing humans up there. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time, my lovely spooky people.